I think for the longest time, because of the way narcissism shows up in relationships, people in a relatively short period of time blame themselves. This is my fault. Maybe I could be better. Maybe I could try harder. What's wrong with me? Because the narcissistic person, through all the gaslighting, has convinced the other person there's something wrong with them. That's why the book is called It's Not You, because people have, because over and over again, they're saying, okay, maybe I said that wrong. Maybe I could say that better. They're always trying to find a way to get it righter. And by giving it a name, it's not meant to be dismissive. It's not even meant to say, walk away from this. I recognize that's not an option that's available to everyone, but it's really meant to say that this is a pattern. You're not losing your mind for saying something is not right here. And because it's a pattern, you can get to this place of radical acceptance. These sorts of entrenched, rigid behavioral patterns that other person has no insight into are not going to change, and you can make your decisions accordingly. And so that's really what it is. I'm telling people, you're not losing your mind, that this is actually a pattern. And because over the years, many therapists have been reluctant to call this out. They'll say, well, they're not in this room, so I really can't comment on their behavior. The hell you can't. If you don't, this poor client is just wandering around the world wondering what's wrong with them. So it's about giving people education. It's about giving them validation. And above all else, it's about telling them that this kind of behavior is not okay. It's not okay for someone to abruptly say, well, I just say what's on my mind. I can't worry about how it affects other people. That's not okay. Doesn't mean that person's going to stop saying it, but it's giving a person permission for saying that behavior is not okay. And it means that when I'm in the presence of it, it's okay to not feel okay. It's okay to disengage from it. It's probably not okay to engage with that person about the behavior, not because you don't have the right to, but because it's going to get you nowhere, and then they're going to rage at you. And what's the point? But it's to get people to the point of saying, like, yeah, there's certain behaviors that are just not acceptable, and I can make decisions on that basis, versus what we've always been taught of, like, well, there's always a way to connect with everyone. No, there's not.
Is part of the problem here, when there's a reluctance to label things narcissism, it's part of the problem that it's a word that has some quite serious negative connotations, right? People often, I would say, misuse the term and will, as the term becomes more and more common, people are calling all kinds of people narcissists. People will say, oh, my partner cheated on me, they're such a narcissist. Well, right. I don't think we can necessarily say that because they cheated, they're a narcissist. No. They might be, but they might not. So I wonder, I don't know, do you like the words? Has it got too much negative baggage associated with it? Or do you still think it's a useful word for us to be using?
Isn't it a funny word, right? For a word that has so much negative baggage associated with it, the qualities that are encompassed within it are associated with success, right? So we will say, just this morning, was reading an article about someone, straight talker, speaks his mind, calls it out. He's so successful, billionaire, clear thinker. No, he's an unempathic, entitled bully. And those words showed up in the article too, but never did the word narcissist, right? The guy was clearly a narcissist that they were writing about, right? But the very qualities you need to succeed in capitalism are narcissism. So that's where everyone wants to be a narcissist. Then you got the big house, your parents are so proud of you. Isn't that great? But then we don't like the word. It's like, pick a lane, people, right? And so the word, though, does carry negative connotations. From the beginning, it's really only been showing up in the psychological literature. Probably late 1800s was the first time we saw Otto Rank, Sigmund Freud, even Havelock Ellis. These folks wrote about it. And it was never a good thing. It's never been a word that was good in psychology. I mean, we would say that the primary narcissism of the infant is normal, that the infant is entirely self-serving because it serves a survival capacity. But beyond that, we don't think of it as good. And so although we reward egocentricity, right? When we look at our economy, influencers and people who draw attention to themselves through good or bad ways are the ones who are making money, who hold power in society. That gets concerning, right? Because the bad word is resulting in good things, and yet people don't want to be called it, but they have those qualities and they succeed. So I think we're sort of in this kind of really recursive loop. But you're absolutely right. I don't know a single person out there, if you called them a narcissist, would be okay with it. Maybe a handful of people who are just sort of being snarky, but by and large, people don't like the word, right? So, and the other problem is the word is now being misused because it's a heavy word, because it's considered an unpleasant quality. You're right. The person who will go on TikTok and say, my boyfriend cheated on me, he's a narcissist. He may not be a narcissist. I mean, he was obviously not a very good boyfriend, but he may not be a narcissist. I'll say, you'll have to show me more. And, or anything that people might say. People will say, this person yelled at a flight attendant. I'm like, that's not okay. Tell me more, right? So I think that we want to go right in there and assume this person's narcissistic because they did a bad thing that hurt you. And what's then happened is the word has lost some of its potency, which is concerning to me because it's a powerful and it's a meaningful word. And it describes a lot of things that go together. Instead of having to list all the ingredients that make the soup, I can just say soup and you know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, the word has been really co-opted. We didn't use the word. I mean, I have to tell you, this is very much a mental health word. When I first started doing this work in the early 2000s, I mean, only people used the word were the mental health profession. I mean, there was books in the 70s, like The Culture of Narcissism, Christopher Lash's book. Those came out and they had some popular reach, but it's not a word we used a lot. So this is really something that's come up a lot in the last 20, 25 years. It's changed in the world of politics, certainly since 2016 in the United States, even similarly in the UK. You have these very narcissistic politicians out there. That entire enterprise has become more like that. So we're seeing that the word is circulating more because those qualities are getting more and more rewarded in more and more public people. But I don't like how I'm seeing the word co-opted. It is a good word. People don't think of it as a nice word, but yet we still reward the behaviors. So it's confusing.
Yeah. Once you're aware of this stuff, you can see those patterns sometimes quite clearly in the way people speak and how they interact or when they get challenged. And I also think, about the misuse of the word, it's almost an inevitable consequence, isn't it? It's a bit like trauma. It's not been spoken about enough. Now it's been spoken about, which is great. But by amplifying the reach of these words, they are going to get misused a little bit. I'm not sure what you do about that apart from keep trying to educate people. Do you know what I mean?
100%. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the example of trauma because even within the field of people who study and treat trauma, there's a lot of controversy because if you talk to the old school folks, the folks who've been doing the trauma work since the 70s, back in those days, it was really like they had to fight to get, for example, even the people who were victimized by sexual assault to have that recognized as trauma, right? So they had to fight the fight for what we now know as trauma to even get that recognized. So then as time went on and other forms of trauma were recognized, betrayal trauma, relational trauma, there was now fight within the field. Like what's big T trauma? What's small T trauma? And now fast forward to now and people will say, oh, someone was wearing the same dress as me at a party. It was such a trauma. I'm like, no. That's not a trauma, right? So it's we see these kinds of uses of these terms. And I think what happens is people then feel invalidated because my biggest concern, frankly, is that when people are going genuinely through narcissistic relationships, like genuinely all of it is there, the harms are very, very clear. And when the word is misused and bandied about in these online spaces, it not only loses its potency, there's then a doubting of the experience of people who've been through these relationships. Oh, maybe you were just through a tough relationships, or maybe there was a problem with just you, thus reharming the people in these relationships. So I think to me, the concern is that there is harm that comes to people who have been really through narcissistic relationships at any point in their lives. And that other people weaken the word. And then they are then doubted once again, because the experience of the survivor of the narcissistic relationship is to chronically be doubted by everyone, including their own selves. So that's my concern. And you're absolutely right. All we can do is keep educating, keep calibrating people, to what the right answer is, educate mental health professionals so they know it. So at least when somebody enters that space, the person they're talking to has a better working model, because genuinely, this is not taught in graduate school. We do not teach clinicians about narcissism. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what it does. And it's not even considered important enough to teach. So if we can at least do that, then the people who are getting the information can support folks who are going through it.
So the subtitle on your new book is Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. Okay, let's take that in two parts. Identifying.
Mm-hmm.
So you have mentioned some of these traits and behaviors. What else do people need to know, perhaps, to identify that someone in their life is exhibiting narcissistic behaviors? Is just knowing that list enough? Or do they need to know other things? You mentioned before a term, gaslighting. You've written about love bombing. I mean, maybe we need to speak to some of these other terms to really help people understand that, yes, this is or this might be going on in my life.
Yeah, understanding the laundry list of how it shows up in a person, like the traits, if you will, that's step one. Step two is understanding the relationship dynamics that accompany those traits.
Okay.
It's almost like view the traits, and then step one is understanding the traits. Step two is understanding what motivates the narcissistic person. And that's simple. That takes me a second, which is they're motivated by power, control, dominance, and getting narcissistic supply, which is getting admired and revered and validated. And then power and dominance obviously give that to them all the time. So they want asymmetric relationships. They want relationships where they're in the power position, where it's all about them, where they're constantly getting validated. So that's what's motivating them. So in a way, it's like, now you know how they're playing the chess game. It's always going to be a power move. Everything they're doing is to overpower and dominate, so they help hold the upper hand. That then takes us to the dynamics, how it shows up in a relationship. So the patterns you see in narcissistic relationships are, first of all, there's a cycle to these relationships. They often start off, and right now I'm talking more about adult relationships we sort of choose, people we date, people we work with, people we're friends with. Talk about families and parents, it's a little bit different, right? Because we don't choose them. But in the relationships we choose, narcissistic people are very charming, charismatic, confident, in a strange way, can even be very comforting. They are well put together. They're attractive. This is exactly what we're told we're supposed to look for in a person. So we were talking about all this lack of empathy, entitlement, arrogance, not so nice. Charm, charisma, confidence, it's hard to undersell those, right? We're told those are good qualities, attractiveness. So they have all this stuff we're told is good. People get drawn in. And early in the relationship, it can feel otherworldly. It can feel fairy tale. People will say, I felt understood like I've never been felt before. I felt seen. I felt heard. The narcissistic person's a sprinter. They can give anywhere from 4 to 12 really good weeks. 4 to 12 weeks is a long time when you're caught in some sort of love story or intense friendship story, but it's usually a love story. Then the devalue phase starts. And in the devaluing phase is where we see sort of the more classical narcissistic relationship behaviors kick in. The dismissiveness, the invalidation, minimization, gaslighting, manipulation, rage. You might see betrayal. You'll see deceit. You see, it runs hot and cold. And that's why the narcissistic relationship is so confusing. There'll be a couple of good days. You'll have some good sex. You'll have a fun weekend. And then boom. And you'll have no idea what's setting them off at first. So you blame yourself. You're like, how is it we had such a good time last night? And they go to work and they come home and they're raging at me. So people are like, what did I do? Like, did I leave something out? Did I say something? And then the narcissistic person might even, like I said, double down on that. Like, oh, if only this house was a little cleaner, or only how come you don't ask me about my day? Or how come you don't tell me I'm great? And then you start saying, I'm going to have to tell them they're great. So you can see how this starts getting to be a really confusing cycle, because then there's another good day and you're like, oh, I must have just been misperceiving that. That's me. God, they had a tough day at work. And that cycle of hot, cold, good, bad, on, off creates something called the trauma bond, where a person engages in a lot of justification. They're very confused. They blame themselves. They doubt themselves. They start to justify the relationship because there's enough good days to keep them in. It's not always bad. And then there's what we call more of a discard cycle, which is when the narcissistic person may withhold or withdraw, maybe cheat on you, lie to you, or a person tries to get out of the relationship because they're getting burned out on it. And the final cycle, which doesn't always happen, is something called hoovering. Word makes more sense to you in the UK, vacuuming, right? Hoovering, sucking a person back in. Narcissistic people are about control and dominance. So when you get out or it ends or they leave you, in their life doesn't go the way they want, or they just want your supply back, your admiration and validation, or it's a cat and mouse game. Can I get them back? They will then try to suck you back in. That doesn't always happen. But this sort of idealization, devaluation cycle is classical in these relationships. And it is cloaked in all this manipulation and confusion, but it's peppered with those good days. And that right there is the narcissistic relationship.
You know, Dr. Ramani, one of the most striking things to me as I was reading your latest book was that term you just mentioned, supply, narcissistic supply. It really got me to pause and reflect, because we normally think of that term supply in the context of drugs, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, not in the context of human behavior, but I thought it was really interesting. Why did you feel that was the word that described so well what a narcissist needs?
Well, you know what's so interesting about the world of narcissistic relationships is this really interesting vocabulary has developed around it that survivors use: flying monkeys and love bombing and narcissistic supply and breadcrumbing and all these other words that are very descriptive. So this concept of narcissistic supply, I did not come up with this term. It's been around for a while. It is this idea of it's the one-sided, one-way admiration and validation. And that doesn't just come from people saying, it's not just praise, right? It can be money. It can be status. It can be proximity to famous or notorious or wealthy people. It can be having a very attractive partner. It can be, you know, again, so in other words, your attractiveness in their presence is supply. It can be flirtation. It can be sex. All of these things can be supply. It's anything that feeds that need for admiration and soothes the narcissistic person's fragile ego.
Yeah, interesting. Gaslighting. That, I think, is another term that is growing in popularity, or certainly growing in its use. Could you explain what gaslighting actually is?
So gaslighting is a tool of psychological manipulation that involves dismantling the reality of the other person to destabilize them, and then to double down on that destabilization by confirming that there's something wrong with the person being gaslighted. So that's a long way of saying that you doubt the memories, experiences, perceptions, physical environment of a person. Okay, so that's one step of gaslighting. In order for gaslighting to happen, there has to be some trust in the relationship, right? It could be a family member, it could be a partner, it could even be a friend, it could even be an expert, like a physician. All of these people are in a position where there's some level of trust, so they're in a position to be able to gaslight, right? Because even if it's a trust you have of like I said, a parent or a sibling or something like that. Then they, again, doubt reality, experience, perception. I never said that. You're remembering that wrong. I didn't put the keys there, that kind of thing. They then tell the person there's something wrong with them. Okay. I don't know. I'm a little worried about you. You're getting really paranoid. Like, you didn't see that text. I didn't send that text. And I've been noticing like you're getting weirder. Like, have you seen a doctor? So it's a real, like, I'm worried about you. They'll even say, I'm worried about you. So there's now this sense of there's something wrong with the person who's now already been told you've remembered something wrong, right?
So do you need both of those?
Yes.
For this to be gaslighting? Because
yes.
the first example that maybe you could take the perspective that two people have a difference in opinion over a certain event, or people are recalling an event differently, but that's not gaslighting.
That's not gaslighting.
Okay.
No. So if the person says, you said da-da-da, and the person says, I don't remember saying that. And the other person says, yes, you did. Here's the text. And the other person's like, okay, I said it, or you're right. I don't remember saying it. That's not gaslighting. Okay. They genuinely don't remember. But when the person showed them evidence, they're like, okay, clearly I said it. If a person does that with a gaslighter, so if you show the gaslighter evidence, right? Because you think like, done, I've won, right? The gaslighter will say, what kind of sick person walks around showing text messages to people like, oh, I guess our relationship's a court of law now. Is that what this is? I don't know that I want to be in a relationship like this, because the ultimate play the gaslighter has is to threaten abandonment. So if you push them too hard, especially with the evidence base, that's when they'll say, you know what? I don't think I want to be in a relationship with a crazy person. I'm not interested in this. I'm not interested in living in a tribunal. So sure, gotcha. I hope you feel better about yourself that you had the text. You feel good now?
Mhm.
You showed me who's boss? Yeah, I'm not interested in this. Now that other person, they didn't want to end the relationship. They just wanted to say, this is what you said. And so now that other person puts that phone down and says, no, that's not what this is about. No, come on, back up. And boom. Gaslighter's back in power.
You said earlier that ultimately all of these traits, all of these narcissistic traits are on some level covering up for a deep, deep insecurity. So it sounds to me as though when that person gets shown the evidence that they, were wrong or they actually did say that thing,
Mm-hmm.
you're getting so close to the bone of exposing that
That's right.
there's almost like an equal or even more vicious response.
Correct.
Than had you never shown them the evidence in the first place. Because the evidence,
Exactly.
You're getting too close to the truth and they can't afford for that truth to be exposed. So they have to, go out full out attack, basically. Is that a fair description?
That's a very fair description. And because, like I said, most people just want to create a space of transparency and equity and accountability in their relationship. They don't want to end the relationship. That the gaslighter then is not only explodes, further destabilizing the other person, but then they threaten the thing that the other person doesn't want. And if the other person really doesn't want that, they're going to take action, if you will. They don't want to end it. They don't want it to be that. And then that might put the brakes on the gaslighters now in that position of power. So and remember, gaslighting doesn't happen once. It happens day after day after day. So over time, a person in a gaslighted relationship feels very silenced because now they know there's no point in showing the evidence. There's no point in calling them out. And there might be enough times where there is no evidence, right? There's none of that a person's like, did I remember that wrong? Or I thought I had the right date. Or so it's, we're all very busy people. So it's plausible. Many times the thing that the gaslighter gaslights about is plausible. But the challenge is that many people are using gaslighting to say it's just a disagreement. It's not a disagreement. It's not a difference of opinion. It's none of those things. So if a person says, I like pepperoni pizza, and the other person says, no, I like cheese pizza, and the other person says pepperoni pizza is better, that's not gaslighting. That's just a difference of opinion. So I think people are using the word, or even just saying things like a person might have moved the remote control for the TV and not remembered they moved it. And that's not gaslighting, right? Moving the remote control, somebody moving the remote control and then lying about moving it to drive another person crazy, that's gaslighting.
What's love bombing?
So love bombing is that intense indoctrination into a new narcissistic relationship. Traditionally, we think of love bombing as the sort of fairy tale, full court press, texts in the morning, afternoon, and evening, fancy dates, picnics on the beach, great sex. You take a big, fabulous vacation on your fourth date. It's everything. It's many times love bombing happens very quickly. And during the love bomb phase, a person feels overwhelmed, but it's not always that. Sometimes love bombing can show up as, let's say they're very open with the things that have gone wrong for them. So the narcissistic person is more of my life has just been so hard. I'm so lucky I've met someone like you who gets it. You're so warm. You're so empathic. You're amazing. That's love bombing too, right? So it's not a lot of bells and whistles. It's just hitting someone and it's giving them the thing, the other person, the narcissistic person is giving that other person exactly the experience they want. During the love bombing phase, the narcissistic person is very attentive. Narcissistic people are very, very socially perceptive. They're in a strange way, in a twisted, dark, bleak way, they can actually be quite emotionally intelligent. They can read the room beautifully in a very self-serving way, but they can.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're very skilled in the first few weeks and months of knowing someone at tapping into their vulnerabilities, getting them to fess up to their greatest fears, their greatest concerns. They listen to the conversation. They realize where the pressure points are and they file them away because they're going to use them against that person later. So what feels like intense attentiveness sort of everyone's fantasy, especially if a person had emotionally unavailable parents. It really feels like a love story.
Yeah.
So there's an intensity to love bombing. In some cases, love bombing may simply be someone who spends 24/7 with you. People will say, well, our first date lasted 4 days kind of thing. I'm always like, that's a red flag right off the bat to me, because it overwhelms. And person will say, oh my gosh, we spent like 2 weeks together every single day. Before you know it, we moved in together. Intensity of contact, frequent contact, quickly, like it overtakes a person's life. Isolation could also sort of quietly happen during the love bombing phase. You spend all your time with this person. You're not spending time with your friends or family. You may even sort of change out your work schedule. So you get pulled away from your sort of touchstones and landmarks, as it were. So over that time, in the love bombing phase, you're getting indoctrinated into something, believing that this person hung the moon. This is your love story. This is the greatest love story ever. There's a lot of that flowery language, a lot of soulmate talk, a lot of magical connection talk. It's the sort of metaphysical stuff that, in fact, this person, at this point, you're so kind of dazzled by this bright light in your face that you're not really able to see what's happening. I used this example with someone once, like, when you're driving into the setting sun and it's so bright, you really can't see the other cars. It's actually a little bit dangerous, but it's pretty. It's a sunset. It's dangerous because you can't see the other stuff that's going on. And during that love bombing phase, you start to feel so like, I have to make this work. I want to make this work. And then it forms a lot of the foundation of this trauma bond, of this justification material. We had such a good time. I've never been treated so well. They're everything I want. And you keep going back to that, even when the relationship starts turning bad, which it will turn bad in anywhere from like 4 weeks to about 3 to 6 months.
Let's be really clear on something there, because a lot of what you just described, it sounds very much from the picture you painted, at least initially, it sounds like someone's falling head over heels.
Yep.
And of course, for anyone who has been in that situation, it feels incredible. So it doesn't mean that every relationship where there is this intense phase where people are getting to know each other, they feel passionate about each other, they're having those kind of romantic first few weeks and months, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a narcissistic relationship.
No, it does not.
That's where sometimes this conversation gets tricky. It's like, well, some of that sounds pretty nice, actually. Do you know what I mean?
100%. And it is nice. I mean, but it is a tactic. And the challenge is, though, right, is that it's the too good to be true part. Right. And even in the love bombing phase, the warning signs, the little red flags are starting to show up. Person might be chronically late, or be late to something that matters to you, or or blow off the things that matter to you, but then take you on spectacular dates that they organize. So a person then is like, they are planning all these amazing dinners. So what if they didn't come to this, this
because
party that was
it's all about them. It's all about them.
It's all about them. It's a show they're throwing for them to feel good. And you start to feel beholden sometimes during the love bombing phase. So it's subtle stuff, though. You can see how a person's taking on these fabulous dates and so attentive, but they don't show up to things that matter to you. It's very easy to sort of say like, oh, yeah, whatever. They don't want it. It's going to be so annoying for them to have to be introduced to everyone. And it's my thing anyhow, but it is important to you. And you asked them to come and they didn't. And what will happen, and again, I've worked with people who've been in narcissistic relationships that lasted 50 years. They'll say, I still remember that. We were 4 months in and I got this big promotion and they threw this big celebration for me at work and they didn't come to that. And they said it stuck in my craw for the remainder of the relationship, but I didn't think anything of it at the time because other things were so great. So here's the thing. If you are in a relationship where you're falling in love and it's idealized and they're doing all these idealized-y things, and the other shoe never falls. There is no manipulation. There is no invalidation. There's none of that stuff. You won the romance lottery. No, we're all jealous of you. Go have your happy, happy life and don't tell the rest of us about it. So that's really what that is. I mean, remember, one thing that happens in narcissistic relationships is that they sort of they steal our identity in a way, right? They take us over. We end up being in service to the narcissistic person. And that theft of individuation and identity of like, no, you don't, you're friends, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to take you to the best restaurant in town, so, or gosh, your family, it seems like last time they were not very polite to me. So they start kind of burning some of your bridges for you. If you feel like you can't fully be you, that you're censoring more and more of yourself to keep this kind of exciting thing going, that's a warning sign. But we're not trained. We're like romance in a world where dating apps are the seventh circle of hell. People are thinking, I've won. I'm not going to question this. And so that's why this love bombing thing works so well, and why people look back and say, oh my gosh, I was just love bombed. You know what I tell people? I said, if you can pull it off, it's all about like knowing when to leave the casino, right? At what point are you up enough to say, I think it may be time to go home? And so that's what happens is, you're having a nice love bombing time, write it out, have some of the fun, but then give yourself 3 red flags. 3 red flags turn up, cut bait early. Yeah. The earlier you get out of a narcissistic relationship, the less the negative fallout. Have some fun, but recognize that, that love bomber, you got to ask, are they going to be the one who takes care of you when you're sick? Are they going to listen to your problems again and again you're having at work? The answer to that is no. And I think that sadly, even though we're grown-ups, we're so heavily indoctrinated into a world of fairy tales and blissed out romances. Social media has made it a lot worse. Yeah. Everybody is sort of putting their weird romantic stories on the internet. And I think a lot of people feel like they need to keep pace. And so as long as people are in pursuit of a fairy tale, the narcissistic people, it's like for them, it's just, shooting fish in a barrel.
I see this in practice. Many people want to make changes in their life. They know what they should be doing. I want to get up earlier to meditate. I want to eat better. I want to find time to exercise. Yet, despite the best intentions, they don't actually manage to follow through. Yeah. Is this something you've seen? And maybe you could talk about, what's going on here, basically.
Absolutely, all the time. And I think that what ends up happening is that people will, like you said, especially and we're talking it's the beginning of the year, they'll set goals. They don't see the goals through, and that almost results in more distress. And so getting to the core of self-sabotage is so essential. And the challenge with self-sabotage is it's so multifaceted, right? I mean, it's like any issue relevant to mental health, it sits on a spectrum, right? It's not like you're a self-sabotager and I'm not. It's not an either or. It's not a black or white. At some level, self-sabotage is something we definitely see as part of mental health issues like depression, that a person, for example, who's depressed will have the thought of, I'm never going to amount to anything, or I have no hope in the future. And so in a way, that belief can drive behavior. So that's one sort of compartment of self-sabotage. Another way self-sabotage shows up is not, again, we don't want to simplify it. It's not like somebody wakes up one morning and says, I'm going to ruin everything I did today. It's very subtle. And so what we sort of classically see in the self-sabotage universe is stuff like procrastination, social comparison, taking on too much. It's behaviors that almost set a person up to not be able to succeed. So it would be a person, I'll give an example because I was a university professor for a very long time. I would see students who were working full time, and then they would sign up for 6 classes. And I'd say, this is not possible. They say, I want to graduate early. And I'll say, everything's going to implode. You'll feel like a failure as a student. You're going to feel like a failure as an employee. Many of them had other responsibilities too. And yet the big goal of, I want to finish school in the allotted amount of time, or, it was this almost a sort of a self-sabotaging level of grandiosity. And so we'd have to bring them down and say, it's okay to take 5 or 6 years to graduate from college. But if you're going to work full time, let's set this up differently. So there's sort of different issues around self-sabotage, which is sort of what is the core of it? What might be driving it? Then there are the sort of foreshadowing behaviors like procrastination, social comparison. A great example would be going on social media. That actually is a form of self-sabotage. A person will give you an example, Rangan. A person will want to lose weight. Okay. And they'll go on social media ostensibly for inspiration and look at these people who have these dramatic weight loss stories, even their friends who are getting up every morning and doing some CrossFit, and then they're showing their smoothie they made for breakfast. And then this person simply isn't able to do that for whatever their reasons are. They may be very real, practical reasons, but as they see their friends' success on social media at weight loss, or even parenting is another great example. A person might be a parent of young children and feel like I'm failing at this every day. And yet they see their friend with their perfectly coiffed children and saying, I'm a failure. And so looking at that will make a person say, I don't even know why I should try. That's another example of self-sabotage. So, and then there's obviously the self-sabotage behaviors of not doing, procrastinating because a person feels too overwhelmed. So it's a complicated behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that example around weight loss, and as you say, going on for, in inverted commas, inspiration, but without realizing it actually is probably making that goal a lot harder to achieve because of how one is going to feel, or one potentially could feel afterwards. Let's go through some of these in a bit of detail. You mentioned procrastination, okay? This is something I think everyone, on some point has experienced. And as you say, these things are on a continuum. So a bit of procrastination, I think we all do at certain times. But for some people, it's really quite paralyzing, isn't it? This inability to make a decision is keeping them stuck in their lives. So what are some things we can think about if we're suffering from procrastination?
So procrastination is a big one, right? Because it links very much to anxiety. Okay. It links to another self-sabotaging pattern of perfectionism, which is a huge self-sabotage issue, right? And it is also, again, the taking on of too much. So when a person procrastinates, what you have to remember is we as human beings rarely do something unless it's rewarding. That's how people are. We are ultimately really, really smart and angsty rats in a maze. We do things that feel good or feel right or feel better. And to that end, human beings, pretty much like all life forms, avoid pain. So procrastination is a form of avoiding pain. Now you might say, what pain is someone avoiding by putting something off? Because that task may bring up feelings of inferiority. That task may bring up feelings of incompetence, of insecurity, of having to face down an uncomfortable truth, any number of things that task, that thing that needs to get done represents. So what better way to avoid the pain than to not engage in the task? Okay, so now the task isn't getting done. For the moment, you're relieved. Right? I'm going to give you the tiniest, simplest example because it happened to me an hour ago. I set my alarm for 5:45 this morning. So I'd be able to get up, take a shower, put my face on, be in front of you. But I had worked late last night. And when I woke up, and it's still dark, right? So I was like, I want to get out of bed. So I procrastinate 15 minutes more. Now it's 6:25. I'm reading the news, reading a book, anything to get out. It's very cold for LA here. So I get out of bed at 6:25. Now I have 20 minutes to get ready, right? Scrambling into the shower, throwing on a face. My bathroom's a mess. The cat's food is everywhere, right? And I was like, I want to be really prepared for this. And ultimately, yes, I was at 6:59 setting up my Zoom, but that's not how I wanted to show up. Now that's a small example, but why didn't I get out of bed? Not because I wanted to ruin talking to you today, but because it felt good to stay in that bed. It was warm. It was cold. Do you see what I'm saying? I was avoiding the pain. That's simple. Now take that to anything else: studying, cooking, meal prep, exercising. So I always will tell people that the most important thing to do is take a task and chop it up. Chop it up into manageable chunks. One way to do that is time. I'll tell people, set an alarm. You have to do whatever this thing is for 15 minutes. And 15 minutes, that alarm's going to go off and you can stop doing the task. In a majority of cases, a person's like, okay, 15 minutes, I can do it. I would say probably 60, 70% of people will keep going. They're like, okay, well, I'm doing it now. Yeah. And they'll turn off the alarm and they'll keep going. There is a subset that'll say, okay, the 15's done. I'm out of this task. but most people will see it through further. It can also be taking it and breaking it into component pieces. I'm just going to chop the carrots first, and then I'm going to take a break. Whatever it may be. I'm not going to go and run 5K the first day I work out. The first day I might do 10 minutes on a treadmill. What we're doing is trying to create habit versus taking on these enormous tasks. And I think the enormity of the task is also part of the issue, is that, okay, a person saying, I have to study for the exam. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you have to read this chapter, make an outline, take a sample test, break down the big amorphous goal or task into its component processes? But that's practical. Yeah. On the other side of this is the management of the anxiety. And that's a deeper dive. Now, ideally, if a person's in therapy, they could talk with a therapist about what they're actually anxious about. If a person's not in therapy and this is not causing them significant distress, they can sit down and ask themselves a question. You're procrastinating. What are you afraid of? Okay. And that's the question of because that's what is the pain that's being brought out by this task, because you're avoiding it. Yeah. And you're avoiding this because it's uncomfortable. And to really do a deep dive into what that discomfort is, and to start to sort of take apart some of those beliefs, because in understanding that, the procrastination can lose some of its power.
Yeah. It's so beautiful the way you broke that down. So much for me there to reflect on. The first thing is that it kind of makes sense that we would procrastinate because we're trying to avoid discomfort or pain. As you say, it may be inferiority, incompetent, uncomfortable truths, whatever it might be. We're human. Of course, we have a bias to wanting to avoid that. So I guess we can be compassionate to ourselves about that. Second thing is that when you talked about breaking it down into manageable chunks, well, that's kind of what all the best behavioral change science shows us as well. If we want to make a change, you got to start really, really small. And one thing that came up for me as you were describing that is something I have spoken about on the show before, is something my wife and I try and do every evening, which is what we call the 5-minute tea ritual. And the goal is simply that, people these days are so busy juggling work, childcare, elderly parents, whatever it might be. It's very easy to be in the same physical space, but not actually spend meaningful time together. So we have this thing where once our children are in beds, we'll come to the kitchen and it's 5 minutes. We say the requirement is for 5 minutes, we sit down over a cup of mint tea or whatever it might be and catch up with each other. Mm-hmm. Now, when we do it regularly, our relationship is immeasurably better. There's more connection, more intimacy, everything is better. And when we think we're too busy to do it, little niggles and problems start to build up. And it's what's incredible, and what I think relates to what you just said, is if you say, for example, I need to spend more time with my partner or my flatmate or whatever it might be, and you say it's got to be an hour, I don't have time, but because it's 5 minutes, it's not as if at 5 minutes we go, hey, babe, you're done now. You've had your 5 minutes. No, Some days when we're busy, it will just be 5 minutes. But often, before you know it, it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, could be an hour. Right. So I think just a couple of observations from me based upon what you were saying there, I think about procrastination.
Yeah, it is. I mean, a part of that, what you're also talking about is intention. And, in procrastination sits alongside avoidance and also sits alongside intention, right? Because it could very well be that you and your wife could say, okay, let's not do it tonight. Let's put it off tomorrow. We'll do 10 minutes tomorrow. And it doesn't work that way, right? Some things do need to be touchstones every single day. They need to be things we do every day. And we do, and everyone will say, no, I'm not able to learn a habit. I say, the hell you're not. You brush your teeth every day. It's not like you say, I'm going to brush my teeth on Friday 5 times as long to make up for the other days. All of us get up in the morning, we do our thing, we brush our teeth. There's things we are, and it's not even like doing other things like drinking water. That is a bodily function we have to do. Brushing our teeth, if you want to view it as It's an optional behavior, yet everyone managed to get that habit on board. And when we think of it, everything is like brushing teeth. The thing is, we don't feel insecure about brushing our teeth.
Yeah.
We do feel insecure about other things. And so I think that that's why it's about drilling down. And what you're talking about too is if there ever was a point when you or your wife were saying, oh, I don't want to do tea tonight, that would speak to a larger issue. What are you afraid of? Maybe there was something you didn't want to talk about with each other. Like, what were you avoiding? That avoidance piece, which is the core of anxiety. What are you trying to avoid? Because all of anxiety is about avoidance. Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. Why aren't you making that phone call? Why aren't you answering that email? Why haven't you returned that text message? I was working with somebody recently who really struggles with social anxiety. And one of their biggest struggles was returning text messages and emails in a timely manner. And it was causing problems for this person, right? It was resulting in disrupted social events. It was leaving this person's social, people on this person's social network were starting to sort of split away from them. They were screwing up job opportunities by not returning emails and even paying bills late. So there's a lot of things happening. And when we came to the core of it, what happened was this person then recognized, I actually don't know what to say. I feel like I'm hogging up people's time. It was a very classically socially anxious sort of framework. And then in not answering these messages for so long, this person did have a true mess on their hands now. It wasn't a mess 2 months before. It was a mess now when we were working on it. And so then it became that slow burn of once an hour returning a text. And then once the person started doing one, they returned others. It wasn't easy because some people said, we were hurt. You didn't respond to our messages. But when this person understood and was able to see in some ways the kind of the distortion of their belief that, that they were using up people's time, they reached out to you. Why wouldn't they want to hear back from you? But that went to, again, a deeper core insecurity this person had. And that ended up becoming the work of therapy.
Yeah, I really love this. It's really trying to dig into the root cause. What's really going on here? Let's not overly focus on the procrastination necessarily. It's like, what does that tell us? What is that teaching us about what's really going on? So I think that's a really great example. Okay, so procrastination is one way in which people self-sabotage. I think the other one you've already mentioned is comparing ourselves to others. Right? So I imagine comparing ourselves to others was also a problem 20 years ago, pre-social media, but I suspect it's got immeasurably worse.
I've had the tremendous privilege of training and practicing as a therapist before there was ever social media.
Okay.
And now I'm practicing with it. And I have to tell you, those of us who have been in this game long enough to understand those bookends, it's like the difference between living in a life, then an asteroid hits the earth, and then living in a new life. Like it was, and it wasn't overnight. But when I think back to the ways we were grappling with some of these issues, you're absolutely right. Social comparison has always been an issue. Before, it might have been a person compared themselves to their neighbor and the neighbor's new car, or a cousin and the cousin's new job, or a classmate or a friend. But now, though, the focus of comparison is everybody in the world that you might identify with. That's why I gave the example of mothers of small children, that even if a mother with a small child, you might live in Los Angeles and the mother of that small child might live in Boston, you identify with them as being a mother of a small child, much like you would a friend with a small child. The difference is this is a very different person than you, and yet you're comparing yourself to them on that one key similarity. Right. And so what this has done is it has caused a tremendous distortion and a tremendous anxiety. But there is a little bit of good news. And some of this goes to some of this work on digital natives versus digital immigrants. And if you talk to adolescents and people who've pretty much grown up in the social media era, so it's sort of been around since they were children, they're actually a bit more circumspect than you'd think. I'm the parent of an adolescent and a young adult, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to be distorted. It's certainly distorted a little, but they are also saying, yeah, no, I get it. They're doing this, they're this. They're a little bit aware of some of the manipulations that happen on social media, which I actually think at a certain age group that didn't grow up with it, there's a greater vulnerability. But all of that said, whether the social comparison is happening in an online space, in your own peer group, in your family group, in your community, what it does, it sets up sort of you're now using the barometer as something outside of yourself. Human beings are a social species. We are going to use other people as sort of a touchstone. But when we over rely on that, then what ends up happening is we start living in service to what we think the world wants us to look like, the world expects us to do, what we think the world is telling us, for example, good parenting is, instead of sort of saying, well, this is my family, these are my children, this is what works for us, even if it may not be what works in the world. And I think that the ability to sort of separate oneself and identity from what the world is demanding from them, that's a kind of a tall order. But when people try to do what they think the world wants, right? I have to take the vacation to this place and stay in this hotel and do this activity because this is what looks good. I'm like, is that the vacation you really want to take? And then that's almost a self-sabotage of the precious amount of vacation time they have, that now they've tried to go and do what they think someone else wants them to do. And they've lost a really important restorative recreational time. It can apply to anything, but the level of social comparison people are engaging in is really resulting in a lot of distress. And in all ways, instead of people saying, what matters to me, it may not be the same as what sort of I'm being told matters to the world at large.
I mean, firstly, I'm pleased to hear what you said about the digital natives. You know, it's something I'm noticing as well. My kids are 12 and 10 at the moment.
Yeah, so they really are natives. Yeah.
But I wonder actually if it's people in their 40s and 50s who might be the worst here. Like, because we didn't grow up with it. And then I remember when Facebook came out in, 2005, 2007. And it was just incredible what you could share with your friends and who you could stay in touch with. And then within 2 years, you've got like 2,000 friends. It's like, that's ridiculous. I don't know these 2,000 people. They're not real friends. So I think that's really interesting. But, you know, Dr. Ramani, what can people actually do? Because it's easy to say to people, don't compare.
Right.
It's not good for you. We all know when we compare too much, like it doesn't feel good. Yet these platforms are so, I don't know, they're so tempting for so many of us. What do you practically do with people who are falling into that trap?
Yeah, it's a tough one because I think that in some ways when you're younger, you are more impressionable. I think that social pressures matter more when you're younger, which actually makes sense in terms of, because that's a time when people are starting a career, choosing a partner, all of that. As you get older, I think that the kind of the stereotype of the older person is like, I don't care what other people think of me. There is some truth to that. And so I think that the place to begin is not to tell people to not socially compare, but to actually drill down into themselves and very intentionally, honestly, even once a day, to ask themselves the question, who am I? What do I stand for? What am I about? They seem like such simple questions. You can do them while you're sitting on a bus, on a subway, in the car, taking a walk. Look, who are you? Like, what is your you? You know, what matters to you? And all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're trying to shoot for something extraordinary or ordinary or everything in the middle. When you do that, you may catch yourself in saying, it's really sort of the model of keeping up with the Joneses. I was so focused on keeping up with the Joneses that what I'm about is, a person might say, I'm about family. And actually, I don't really care that I have a big car if I'm able to get home by 4:30 and spend time with my children. Someone else will say, I'm a teacher and I'm really about teaching. And maybe I'm not doing this and this or whatever, but that's what I've signed up to do, or whatever it is a person does. I'm a storyteller, whatever. And it's funny. I can only give this from a personal example, but I was recently in a situation where I was being told, you're not doing enough of this, Ramani, and you're not doing enough of that, and you could be doing this and you could be doing that. And actually was really anxious about it in the last few days. And when I woke up this morning from my procrastinated rush, I did in the shower reflect on this idea of, Ramani, what are you about? Like, what is it you set out to do? And when I did that, it became a recalibration of, actually, you are doing what you set out to do. Perhaps if you did what these other people were doing, you'd make more money, you'd have more notoriety. But I'm like, do you need those things? I'm like, yeah, anyone wants a little more money, but more money, more headaches. I'm able to pay my mortgage. I've got a car. I've got food in the house. And so I thought, before you get pulled in that direction, pay attention to whether you're living in alignment. And I actually don't think a lot of people have ever asked themselves that question of who are you and what are you about? Because the more of that you do, it does create a little distance between yourself and the social media. And you're able to say, I see that this person is doing this, and that's great. I'm happy that they're doing X, Y, or Z. I'm doing what I want to do. And then all of a sudden, you're able to actually occupy more of a co-located space of they're doing that. That's different than me. Sometimes we may even wonder, if I had taken that path, or what would this be like? But then also, I even with my own clients, I'll say, let's do a little bit of guided imagery work. Work it as a mental experiment. Take it out in your mind. If you had those other things, like even if I'm saying, if I had more notoriety or more money, then how would that pull me off my original mission? What would my day-to-day life look like? Is that what I really want? The old adage goes, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. And so I think that kind of mental work on one's self, we are so focused on other. What do I look like to the world? That many people aren't asking themselves a simple existential question of, what are you about?
Yeah.
And then once you start doing that and you become your reference point, even when you get pulled, and we all do, like that person's got it together. Whoa, that's a really nice house. Or how do you have so much time to travel? You then start seeing yourself within the context of your own life, what you stand for, what you are about. That I think is something that people aren't doing enough. And then if you want to look at social media, you'll be potentially looking at it through new eyes.
Yeah, it's so powerful because it's in some ways, which way do you want to tackle the problem from? On one way, you could say, okay, I'm going to stay not knowing myself with all my insecurities, and I'm going to get tugged every time I go on social media. I'm going to get pulled thinking, I need to do that. I need to do that. Oh, I'm not as good looking as them, or I don't have as much time, or have a nice holiday as them, or whatever it might be. Or because that's an unwinnable battle if you haven't done the inner work. Whereas what you're proposing is actually, if you bolster up yourself, your own self-esteem, figure out who you are, live in alignment with your own values, then you almost insulate yourself and your being so that you are more bulletproof and resilient, I guess, and less likely to be pulled by comparison. I mean, that certainly, as you were saying that, I was playing with that sort of tug of war in my head, thinking a much more sustainable and probably successful way to not suffer with problems with comparison is to do the inner work, isn't it?
Always, and I think the inner work does become, and even with these other things we're talking about, what is it you're trying to fear? What is it you fear? What are you trying to avoid? That this is reflecting on yourself. Yes, you're within a larger system, and you may even say, I feel the pressure because it's coming from my family. It's coming from my partner. You'll reflect where these external pressures are coming from, but it's also then bringing yourself back to, and what do I want this life to look like? I was speaking with somebody who actually said, they were talking to me, they said, wow, I work a lot. I work 7 days a week. I have zero work-life balance. And I know why that is. There's certain things I want to get off the ground. There's certain messages I want to get to the world. And I was talking with somebody who very much has made their lives a 9 to 5, right? 5 o'clock, they're done, and they do not think about work the next day until they clock in at 9 o'clock. And they were very clear on who they were. They're like, I love spending time with my family and in my home, and I like reading books in the evening. And, they were talking about they said, I've had mental health struggles in the past, and pushing myself to a stressful point actually really harms my depression. And so, and they're fine. They don't live in a palace. They definitely are they're financially cautious. But this person had done the work to say, I know myself. And, they said that I'd love to have some of the things you have, but it's not so important that I know also I like having my evenings and my weekends to myself. And I actually really admired the assuredness of this person. They said, yeah, sure. I would love a new car. I'm not saying that this person they weren't like an ascetic or like a monk. They were someone who's like, yeah, I'd like those things. But what's more important to me is this time with my child, my children, this time with my partner. We go on the weekends, we have picnics, we have beaches, and we have times at the beach. And I remember thinking like, this person actually knows themselves better than me. Like, why am I chasing my tail all the time?
Yeah.
And that conversation has stuck with me, because there was, this person was just so very assured in almost what we could call an ordinary life, which I personally think is extraordinary because I really adore this person. But they were so clear on it, and they were also very clear of being custodians of their own mental health history. That this person who's lived with depression and anxiety, and has said that kind of stress is going to spin me out. This is part of who I am. My depression's part of who I am, and I have to be careful. And I really, really admired that.
Yeah, when I hear stories like that, it just really makes me pause, because I do think many of us end up chasing the wrong things. The quest for more money, more status, more holidays, whatever it might be. Often, if people end up there getting those things, they still feel empty, because actually it wasn't what they really wanted. But again, comparison, this reminds me a little bit of how you finished your TEDx talk, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. You said at the conclusion, I think, the very qualities associated with material success are bad for our health.
Yeah.
And then you went on to say, we need new metrics of success. We need to reward things like authenticity, compassion, kindness, and empathy. But that's kind of it, isn't it? The system around us, the society around us is set up to value a lot of things that just don't make us happy, basically.
Right. That's right. That's it. Well, it's set up to value things that are going to keep commercial systems running, right?
Yeah.
So you really, really have to be aware of the value of compassion. That's why I'm saying the knowing who you are, giving you the example of that person who it's a very clear, structured work hours. They don't have a lot of money. They do have a very loving family, and they found these joy in these simple things. That came, it came at some cost. That person had been in therapy for a long time, struggling with depression. And so they'd done a lot of inner work. And it's much easier, frankly, I think it's much easier to chase more money, to chase for a car. Those are actually easier goals to chase for, because they're sort of right there in your hand. Like, look, I got the goal. There's the car in the driveway, versus having to do that inner exploration and really sitting with who you are. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of who we are, who we want to be, how we want to show up in the world is actually at odds with what we were told we're supposed to be. People were told you have to be, I culturally grew up in a South Asian family where you have to be a doctor. You have to do this. You have to have a certain outcome. Like, it was very much like there was a way you should live. And as an immigrant's child, I really felt that pressure to sort of deliver on the sacrifices that my parents made. And I don't know that I became the right kind of doctor, but even when I changed my program of study to study something that was more compelling to me, I felt I had betrayed them. That's a really heavy weight for a 23-year-old woman to have had on her back.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying this is easy, that you just sort of sit there in lotus position and say, oh no, actually I want to be an artist, and you run off and become an artist. These are things that we really, really have to struggle with and pull the layers off and understand the intergenerational layers that are playing out there, because it's complicated. And I know a lot of my work ethic comes from still trying to almost sort of please and honor this cultural tradition I came from. And I have to keep catching myself in that.
You know, as a fellow child of immigrant parents here in the UK, I can resonate with so much of that, you know, almost word for word at times. I think many of us know what that feels like. It's interesting, your friend who seems to really understand who they are and realizes that everything has a cost and that I'm not prepared to pay that cost anymore. It sounds as though their sickness, their ill health, taught them some really valuable lessons. And that's a theme that often comes up on my podcast, where disease or illness or adversity, whatever you want to call it, can end up being one of the most powerful teachers. And I say that with compassion. I say that with sensitivity. I'm not wishing bad things on anyone. But when they do happen, as they inevitably do in all of our lives, there's often some profound learning on the back end of that. If we, you know, if we're fortunate enough, if we've taken the time, it sounds like your friend went to therapy, learned a lot about themselves and what they need. Is that what you've also found, that when people come to you, they go into your clinic, they're struggling with a problem, that through the process of you helping them learn about themselves, that on the other side of that, they have a much deeper and, I guess in many ways, a better understanding of what life is really about?
Some do, not all. You know, I think that again, that's that spectrum, that continuum. I think some people can get there and they come into therapy, and usually people come into therapy because something's not going right. Very rarely does somebody say, oh, I want to grow more, I'm going to go to therapy, right? It's really, I'm having trouble in my marriage, or I'm having trouble at work, or I'm feeling really sad, or I'm so anxious I can't get out of bed. It's you know, I'm struggling with drugs and alcohol, whatever it may be. Those are the things that might get somebody into therapy. So they're typically already in a crisis. Obviously, I think therapy has sort of like, it's a two-part goal, if you will. The first goal of therapy is to help the person cope with and get the tools with and get them out of that acute episode of distress. From there is the sort of that level 2, where it is then continuing to practice those tools. I always say that a person comes into therapy with an empty or a half-empty toolbox. The goal of therapy is to fill that toolbox up, but also teach them how to use those tools. So once they're either in between sessions, or they start weaning off the therapy, or they stop attending, they're like, okay, I have something here I can turn to. I have a different way I can talk to myself. I have a breathing exercise. I've thought about this issue differently. Whatever tools and skills that they have taken out of therapy, that's sort of the goal. No, but like I said, not everyone gets there. There are things that can block people in perpetuity from getting there. And that's, I mean, it's a tough way to live, but it's, you know, therapy is not a miracle, right? There has to be tremendous motivation on the part of the person coming in. And it's not a magic pill. It's not a surgery. It is a very collaborative process. And if the client is not willing to sort of almost make some of the psychological sacrifice, which is feeling uncomfortable, feeling a little unsafe at times in their life, like pushing themselves to the next level. If somebody's not willing to do that, there's only so far they're going to get. I mean, that's going to limit them.
So under the umbrella of self-sabotage, we've spoken about procrastination. We've spoken about comparing ourselves to others. I think another way in which we often self-sabotage without realizing it is when we're surrounded by people in our lives, I guess you could call them toxic people, or people who aren't necessarily supporting our goals and what we actually want. Is this something you've seen? Would you say that this also fits under the umbrella of self-sabotage?
Absolutely. I mean, again, my expertise is in working with people who are healing from what are called narcissistic and antagonistic relationships. I think this goes well beyond somebody not supporting your goals. This is about people who are actually invalidating somebody else, right? Confusing them, devaluing them, you know, leaving them or saying to them that you are less than, chronically criticizing them. I think that that's actually probably the biggest self-sabotage of all, is continuing to stay in those relationships and not attempting to either see them clearly, or when it's possible, it's not always possible, to distance or get out of them. Because I think that for a lot of folks, they'll understand why they're avoiding things. They'll understand why they're procrastinating. They can even train themselves to avoid the social media. But if day in and day out, there's a voice in your head that is invalidating you, that is leaving you feeling less than, that is questioning you, that is questioning reality, you're constantly confused, you're filled with self-doubt, and you continue to maintain that relationship in the status quo and keep thinking, well, maybe I can change them. Maybe I can get them to notice me. That is the ultimate self-sabotage, because you can give so much bandwidth to those toxic relationships and just keep getting sucked deeper and deeper into another person's vortex. And like I said, I know that a lot of people can't distance from really unhealthy relationships. They may be in marriages, for cultural, traditional, religious, or reasons of finances or children, they can't leave, or they genuinely love the person and they say, for all their toxicity, there's something that matters to me here. There may be their family and they feel they can't step away. It could be a job that they need. So I'm not so arrogant as to sit here and say, well, the easy solution is to get out. But the kind of work I do with folks is to say, when something is toxic enough and it has been consistently for a long time and nothing you're doing is changing it, and in fact, often making it worse, that there really has to be some level of radical acceptance that this isn't going to shift, and realistic expectations for what you've got in front of you. I'm not saying it doesn't still sting or hurt, but what may come of that is you're less likely to blame yourself for what's happening. Because if you're blaming yourself for what's happening, your entire conception of yourself is shifting to, I'm a bad person. And so these relationships really do shift how people think about themselves. People do feel like, I'm a bad person, I'm disloyal, I'm thinking all these bad thoughts about someone I'm not supposed to be thinking bad thoughts about. And I have to say, probably of all the causes of self-sabotage I've ever worked with clinically or run into, this idea of maintaining toxic relationships and not seeing them clearly is probably one of the, if not the biggest contributor.
How can people who don't know who they are, and I recognize that if you've been in a narcissistic relationship for many years, you forget who you are. How does one go about finding that sense of self, discovering who they are?
I mean, it's a lifelong process. It's not like I'm going to do that this month and I'll have it sorted, right? I always think of it as an archaeological dig. You know how you see people in the dinosaur movies and they've got those tiny little brushes and they're brushing away all this stuff to kind of look, there's a tooth, there's a bone. In some ways, it is an archaeological dig. Like we're digging through these layers of ourselves. And part of this is mindful awareness. It can be bringing in practices like meditation and mindfulness, which can really help a person engage in sort of the process of non-judgment, because judgment is what stops people from this process. Like, this is ridiculous. I want to be an artist. I got to shut that down. That judgment is what just because you love art doesn't necessarily even mean that's going to be your career, but to acknowledge how that creative pursuit may be a part of who you are, to really have those hard sort of explorations within yourself of like, do I want to be a parent? Like, where do I want to live? It's creating time in your life where you have those conversations within yourself. Therapy can be a very useful tool here. If you're working, again, unfortunately, therapy is sort of two different things, right? It's not unfortunate. Therapy is two different things. There's therapy that is designed to address an acute mental health crisis, like person's depressed, severely anxious, managing addiction, any number of things. And it's almost a medical model. But there's sort of a second stream of therapy, maybe a more privileged form of therapy, if you will, where one is doing that kind of self-exploration of talking about those sort of things that they almost feel, I don't even have a right to explore this, but exploring it with somebody who's able to, in a skilled way, help them also understand the barriers to that expression of the true self, right? So I think therapy can be a useful place for that, but a lot of people don't have the funds to do that. So I very much understand that. But it can be journaling. It can be honestly, in some cases with healing from narcissistic relationships, 3-4 times a day, I tell people just put a notification on your phone and touch in with yourself. How do I feel now? Am I hot? Am I cold? Am I hungry? That might seem silly to you, but it's actually not, because if you've been in unhealthy, controlled spaces for too long, someone else told you if you were hungry or hot or tired. They're like, you're not tired. You're not hungry. It's not too warm in here. So it's giving yourself even an opportunity to tune into your own physiology. How does my body feel right now? Am I comfortable right now? Like, where do I feel things in my body right now? Those kinds of like body scan, mind awareness things are little things we can build into a day to connect with our body. And that might seem like, how is that connected to what I want to do? It's not about what I want to do. It's who am I? And it's even giving permission to, again, I'm going to just put myself out there as an example, is that I'm a deeply introverted person. So even though you and I have been talking here for hours and I've loved it, right? It is not you're not going to throw me into parties and social gatherings. But for years, I tried to fight that nature in me because young people were not young anymore, but back in the day, I was supposed to socialize and you're supposed to want to go to parties. And come on, Ramani, you're such a party pooper, right? And I'm thinking, no, actually, I'm not a party pooper. I'm an introverted person. I prefer to be in my own head and read, and that's where I'm happy. And don't get me wrong, I love people, but in small groups. And if I do go to a large event, I'm very tired afterwards. That exploration of self allowed me to give permission to that part of myself to say, it's okay to say, I want to see you. This is going to be too much for me to come to a big event, but can we put a dinner in the books next week? That was allowing that to happen. But we're breaking through programming, and that's hard work. It's also saying, like, I recognize for me as a South Asian woman who had immigrant parents who went through all the rigors they went to immigrate and the pressures that came for that. They had an agenda for me, and I kind of fell into that agenda out of duty and obligation, but it's not who I was. It was decades of work of feeling guilty that I saw the sacrifices that prior generations made, but that wasn't who I was, to finally give permission to what I wanted. I made so many mistakes along the way because I was trying to live into an identity that was really locked into loyalty, duty, obligation, recognizing the sacrifices of others.
Yeah.
This is not easy work.
No. Of course, putting in place the right boundaries is really important for all of us, whether we are in narcissistic relationships or not. People often struggle with this, especially when they've never used boundaries. It can feel very foreign and you don't quite know what you're doing because you're not used to doing it.
It's a tricky conversation. Boundaries. I think that what's so difficult is I've worked with so many hundreds, thousands of people who have gone through narcissistic relationships. The boundaries conversation is a thorny one because you got to remember boundaries don't work in a narcissistic relationship. And when we tell people to make boundaries in those relationships, we're sending them in to get hurt. There's no point. The boundary has to be very interior. So it's an internal boundary. The internal boundary might be, I'm not taking the bait. I am not going to engage with them on this point. It might even be a boundary, honestly, of I'm not going to share with them the good news I got because they're just going to make fun of me. That's the boundary. So I think that the mistake we make is that we think that boundaries are things we communicate to someone else about their behavior. Good for you if you've got people in your life where that works. Okay. But that's so rarely the case for people who are in the place I am. And somebody's like, boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. And people are like, what's wrong with me? Maybe I'm the problem because I can't set a boundary. I'm like, there's no setting a boundary here. The boundary is within you. And like, I'm going to give you that classical example. The mistake people will make is that I'm going to tell the narcissistic person this cool thing happened, or I have this good news. And then they say terrible things and they mock you. And so don't do it anymore. A boundary is when something good happens to me, they're not going to know about it. Not from me. And if something bad happens to me, I'm going to have to find a different place to share it, not with them. That's a boundary. You see what I'm saying? And so I think we have so much of our conversation of boundary is I'm going to tell them I don't want that. They can't do that. They shouldn't say that. Not only they're not going to listen, they're going to gaslight and humiliate and shame you into oblivion. Save yourself the trouble, set the boundaries within you, engage in radical acceptance, and disengage. Yeah. Disengagement is a boundary.
Yeah, no, super useful. I don't feel we've even scratched the surface of the content that's within your new book. It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. So for anyone who's interested in this topic, it really is a fabulous read that's going to help people, identify and then go on to heal. To finish off our conversation today, Dr. Ramani, I have, I guess, two final questions to ask you, two quite different questions. The first question is, If someone has been listening to this conversation and thinks, you know what, I think I may be a narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have got a lot of those traits and I'm harming the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give to that person?
First of all, good for you. If you're having that kind of insight and self-reflective process, you may not be a narcissistic person. But if indeed really you're like, okay, like, yeah, I'm listening to this and I'm going to have the painful realization, or you look around, you see a lot of burned bridges. I think that armed with that kind of insight, while in general, narcissistic people don't make significant changes in their personality. In fact, most of us don't make significant changes in our personality. We can change behavior. It's hard. It's hard because these behaviors are often very reactive and automatic. And therapy for people who are narcissistic often is a very, very long-term process, especially for and a person might look back and say, I get where this came from. It was a lot of adversity. These are survival patterns. I'm like this because the only way I can feel safe. Those are incredibly important insights. And good trauma-informed therapy, for somebody who's had that kind of origin story, can actually go a long way. Finding that therapist you feel comfortable with, but recognizing this is hard work. And almost like anyone with a chronic health condition where every single day they might have to adhere to medication or do physical therapy or do something for their chronic health condition, a person who's narcissistic, who doesn't want to do this harm anymore, who doesn't want to live in this space anymore, has to be mindful all the time, has to think about, how can I take responsibility and accountability here? How can I show up and be aware of the other person's needs and wants and not minimize them? How can I do the work internally to manage this sense of internal shame and vulnerability and all of that? It is a lot of work, and it is a commitment, and it is a lifelong commitment. So if somebody wants to do that, there are good folks out there who can do that work, but it is a lifelong commitment.
Okay, great. Because I do want to make sure there's hope for people who, as I say, feel that they may be, giving out this behavior. And I think it's important that we also speak to them so that maybe it is a small percentage, but we can still make a huge impact if that small percentage goes, right, I'm going to take responsibility now. The second and final question is for that person who thinks, yeah, you know what, I didn't quite realize that. I kind of knew there was some issues in some of my relationships, but now I'm pretty clear that my partner or my parent or my boss is a narcissist and I am on the receiving end of that behavior. For that person, what are some of your final words for them?
I would say knowing is like a first step in a long journey. Okay. So just sit with that for a minute and look at how the patterns have shown up. You might even do a little bit, become a little bit of a researcher, an experimentalist. If you really are like, am I right or am I wrong about this? Try a couple of things. Express a need. See how that works out for you. Express a want. Contradict them if indeed you feel like you don't agree with them. Try those things out and see how they react, because that's really going to be the places you're going to see the pressure points come out, right? And that might give you the confirmatory evidence. You're like, okay, I am definitely seeing this, right? I didn't want to, but I am. And I think from that point forward is that as you see that these are consistent sorts of patterns, is figuring out sort of how you can find different ways of engaging so you don't get hurt in the same way. So you don't keep repeating the same toxic cycle. I'll just sort of leave you with a very simple mnemonic device from the book, which is don't go deep. And don't go deep. Deep stands for don't do these things. Don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, and don't personalize. And if you can just hold on to that, which is don't keep explaining yourself. They're not listening. Don't defend yourself. They're just going to gaslight you. Don't engage. It's going to get worse. And honestly, don't personalize is the hardest, because this is actually not you. It's not about you. This is their insecurity. This is their inner battle. This is their need to dominate. But it's just that you had the bad luck of being in this position. Anyone else that was their partner or their employee or their child would be enduring a lot of this, if that makes sense. So it's just bad luck that you're in this position with them, because this is the role you had in their lives. But it's not about something in you. It's not because you're weak or you're flawed or you're foolish or anything like that. It's how they go through the world, and that it's not you. That's the core of this book, is that don't go deep, don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, don't personalize. Just starting that process of disengagement and seeing it clearly can start helping you sort of lift part of the weight. Yeah, the grief is coming. It's like a storm cloud on the horizon. I promise you that. But just interacting with it differently you might say like, oh, this is actually already lifting some of this. I'm no longer having the same ridiculous arguments, or basically waiting for a bus that's never going to come to this stop.
There's often this thing that when I lose weight, when I lose this amount of weight, I'll be happy. And I think this really fits into what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
They'll only be happy when that outcome occurs, which is, again, very rigid, because what if you get 90% of the way there? What if you have brought into your life 3 or 4 beautiful practices that are giving you more energy, more vitality, your relationships are better, but you didn't quite meet that goal that may have been unrealistic anyway, and everything starts to fall down. So I think this has so much crossover for so many different things.
And it's even bigger than that, because as we know, the biggest predictor of eating disorders is dieting. And when you think about that number, sometimes people will get so focused, I need to hit this weight number, right? That actually people will get themselves into very disordered, sometimes even dangerous eating patterns. And I have worked with numerous clients who'll say, once I lose 60 pounds, my life is going to change. Then they lose 60 pounds. And nothing changes because they have done no inner work. It was always been about the food restriction, the excessive exercise, all these things they were doing. They get the 60 pounds off. They're actually no longer an interesting person because all they do is be obsessive about food and exercise. So they're not meeting the love of their life. They're not getting their dream job because they've actually become so caught up and over-identified with that goal that they'll actually say that was when I was thin, it was actually one of the worst times of my life, or I was really drawing terrible people. They were drawing people into their lives who were drawn only to their appearance. They were not good people. And so then they got themselves into this really horrific loop of saying, if I gain even a pound, I'm going to lose this relationship and this lifestyle. And I mean, sometimes even to tragic consequence. So it's a real problem.
Pathologizing your own needs, what does that mean?
Yes.
How do we do that? What is the problem with doing that? And how can we change it?
It's huge. Someone was asking me, like, if you could have people just learn one thing in the world, I would say to find a healthy way to express their needs. This is something that's often a very ancient problem for many people. Even in childhood, they may have been shamed for expressing their needs, or being told that they're being impertinent for expressing their needs. And I mean realistic needs. I mean, I'm not saying like I need someone to bring a private jet to me so I can go to a theme park. I don't mean that. It's like a person who's saying that I need something, whether it's something related to nourishment or something relationally, or just wanting to be closer or wanting more time, that to make a need known in an appropriate, aware way, you can't just come barreling in and demand anything you want, is a really hard thing for a lot of people. And so what happens is, especially if their needs were shamed when they were younger, that can then result in a person feeling that their needs are a problem when they're an adult. If they feel either that they don't have permission to ask for anything, or if they do, they're being demanding, they're being needy. And if they're in a toxic relationship, they're being told that they're being demanding and being needy. If you even think about how people date, a lot of sort of the rules and rubrics about dating are very much about like, don't respond too soon. Don't let them know you're really interested. Like, well, I am interested. Why wouldn't I want to tell them that? Yeah. And like, no, you don't want to give it up. So it's like, even how we suggest people get into relationships can be very sort of opaque and confusing. And people are often socialized like to not even ask for what they might need in the workplace, or they'd be afraid if you ask for too much, they may let you go or something like that. And it goes on and on and on. So what happens is that people don't learn to express their needs directly in a healthy way. But what they may learn is to express those needs in an unhealthy, kind of passive aggressive or manipulative way, which isn't good for relationships. They may not learn to express them at all, don't get their needs met, and then they may suffer from that. And so it is and then ultimately it's thinking, well, I'm needy, or this is ridiculous that I need this, or I'm being lazy if I do this. Like a person saying that I want to just take a few hours on the weekend and whatever, do something fun, and thinking, oh, that's not very, I should be cleaning the house instead. Then that's another form of pathologizing one's own needs, like the need just simply to have some downtime. So I think that messaging that people get, and again, it often starts quite young. If we don't break out of that, then we often don't give ourselves, we don't nourish ourselves with what we need, which, like I said, maybe downtime, maybe a day off, maybe spending, going to therapy, whatever it may be. That when people don't getting what you need out of a relationship, that people don't get those things, it can really be bad for them. And I'm even going to push it further, because where it can even start to get dangerous is when people ignore their needs for long enough. They literally start to ignore their bodies. And people may actually ignore symptoms on their bodies. They may put off getting preventative health care. They may say, oh, I don't want to make the appointment. That's a little dramatic going to the doctor for this. And then may have found out that this is something that they should have absolutely seen and communicated with a healthcare provider about. Yeah. So that pathologizing one's needs isn't simply somebody pathologizing the need for a few hours off, or just wanting to take an afternoon to themselves. It could actually be for very much more severe things like health crises.
Yeah, really, really helpful. I think we've done a really hopefully useful deep dive for people on self-sabotage, and I think there was about 7 ways there that we covered, which, I'd be surprised if everyone doesn't at least connect with one of them at some point in their life, right? We're all human. We all fall into these traps and patterns from time to time. As we sort of head towards the end of our conversation, I wanted to ask you about raising children. Mm-hmm. You've been in practice for decades now, for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And what I'm interested in is you've seen a lot of adults who are struggling with various aspects of their life. And a lot of those aspects that they're struggling with may in some way be related to their childhoods. So given what you've seen, what have you learned is the most important thing, or some of the most important things that we can do as parents for our kids to prevent them being those adults who show up needing help in the future?
I think number one, going back to that perfectionism, is we may not make the mistakes our parents made. We're going to make new mistakes. And so that if we look at Winnicott's work, he was an object relations theorist. We look at Winnicott's work. He talked about the good enough parent, right? Good enough mother, but good enough parent. And the good enough parent makes just enough mistakes that the child has to figure some of this stuff out on their own. You don't want to respond to the child's every need. The kid's got to figure some stuff out on their own. It's a balancing act, right? You want to be responsive enough that the child believes that they have a secure base, that they learn to regulate, that they feel safe in the world, but not so much that they feel hovered over and don't ever get to make a mistake on their own that they can solve and resolve and regulate and soothe themselves. You want the child to learn how to self-soothe. And so I think that what we need to understand is that all any of us can do is be that good enough parent. But in our terror of not wanting to repeat the patterns that our own parents committed, we may rather unseeingly walk into a whole new set of mistakes. And it's basically that there's a real risk of overcorrection. I can say very frankly, I did that. It was very difficult for my parents. They were immigrants. They got a lot of stuff wrong. It harmed me. There's no two ways about it. The fact, and I understand that. I'm able to see that in a very circumspect context. But in my zeal to avoid what they did wrong, I got to make a whole new series of mistakes. And so I think that if I were to go backwards, I think in some ways the best way I can give parenting advice is to look back at what I didn't get right. And I understand some of it was circumstantial. I've been divorced, and I know that took its own toll on my children. And I certainly can't sit here and say, well, I wish I had been better at choosing a more compatible partner with me. So I didn't do that. I did. And so it is. But I think that, that to be mindful and present with children to the degree you possibly can. I mean, listen, if dinner is burning and there's someone at the front door and all of that, we can't always be, but there are moments we can be, to really allow that child to feel heard and seen and recognized so that they go into adulthood believing that they're worthy of being heard and seen and recognized, right?
Yeah.
And so that is something that I think is so crucial. And I also think another crucial thing is allowing children to experience disappointment. We are in an era of bubble wrapping children, so they never have to have anything bad happen, and they always need to be comfortable. And that's also a real mistake too, because the incapacity to self-regulate is a real problem. And when people can't self-regulate, they're at risk for using drugs and alcohol, using food, and using things external to them to soothe. And it's to leave a child feeling that they're secure and safe enough in the world and can trust themselves enough to sort of regulate themselves, in that moment. But like I said, I'm willing to hazard that I was about 50-50. I got as many things right as I did wrong. I'm definitely not going to give myself the more right than wrong. My children could answer that question better. But like I said, we have to be, I think my biggest mistake was in my overcorrection. That's where I made a lot of my mistakes. I'm like, I'm absolutely not going to do what my parents did. But in doing that, I created new mistakes. It was almost like when you get surgery on one leg, you put too much weight on the other leg and then you screw up the other leg. That's what I did.
Yeah. I think many of us fall into that overcorrection trap.
Yeah.
One final thought I wanted to discuss with you is something that I heard you say once that I've been thinking a lot about over the past few days. And it's when you said that you really want us as a society to challenge the idea that mental illness is a disability.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that it's we're back to that issue of a continuum, right? That I think that I struggle with even what the construct of mental illness is, in the sense that what I use as a barometer is how a person is feeling in the world and how they're functioning in the world. And I don't mean functioning in terms of earning money and all of that. I mean like maintaining relationships and feeling purposeful and meaningful and all of that. Those are the things that I would look for in a person. In our zeal to give it a name, right, to call it bipolar disorder or depression and all of that, we kind of get lost in that labeling, and then we limit people, right? He's depressed, so he may not be able to do as much. He's anxious. I mean, and we know this to not be true, that people with a wide range of mental illnesses and mental health issues are actually contributing in many ways. Now, when we get into the area of severe psychotic mental illness, schizophrenia would be an example. There we do see impairments that would make it difficult for a person to function in the world. So that might fall more under a person being differently abled, right? There may be things that might be more challenging, but even there, I mean, I think the innovative work and people working with people with severe psychiatric illness, including psychotic illness, is still meeting a person from a compassionate place on how can we then, given some of the limitations of the symptomatology they're experiencing, still allow them to achieve as much potential as possible and help them be as safe in the world as possible. Because for individuals who are living with psychotic illness, the world can feel like an incredibly unsafe place, especially if they're not getting adequate treatment. But I think that it's we don't accord people who are going through experiences of mental distress and anguish and despair and the sorts of, at times, functional limitations that can come from that, and certainly the subjective distress that comes from that. We still view it very suspiciously. And we view these people as not being able to, again, like I said, function well, which is completely untrue, because if you look at the rates of what mental illness epidemiology is, anywhere between 10 to 20% of the population, depending on whose numbers you're looking at, that would mean if you work with 10 people, 1 to 2 of them is living with, significant mental health issues, right? And if you're looking around saying, oh, everyone seems to be doing well, then I don't know who that is. You don't know who that is. And so I don't like the term disability. I really am focused on people who bring different abilities. And I mean, at the risk of sounding too, sociopolitical, I really do get exhausted with people thinking that the measure of a person is how they can contribute to the economy. And that's how we sometimes designate whether or not somebody has ability. And I don't think that that's what ability is. I think it is about being a good, compassionate, respectful human being who's sort of part of this ecosystem of the world, and not just that they can make money for people and make money to make other people money. So I think that that's sort of a bias I have in this space. But I think that we're working on models of diagnosis and mental illness that were conceived of by a very small group of people in a room. And, if you look at how the DSM was originally written, these were very privileged white men who sat in a room in New York City, and most of them were psychoanalysts, and they started drawing down what they thought were these sort of mental health conditions. And that became the core of what is still the DSM. Yeah. And while there is a little bit more research on biology and culture and all that, at the end of the day, this is what a group of privileged white men in the 1950s sat in an office in New York, the very office I've laid eyes on, and came up with this stuff. And I think in that way, there is a very colonizing influence of how all of this works. We do not account for different perspectives. We do not account for different abilities. And I think that other industries like pharmaceuticals have really gotten their hands in there. So I think that we are getting to the point where there needs to be a real, I don't want to say revolution, but maybe renaissance would be a nicer word, of like taking some of this apart. And I have to say the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization, they're making changes that I actually think are a little bit more forward thinking, but I still think we're stuck in a framework that was dictated by a very narrow band of human beings too long ago.
So much there to unpick. I think we're going to have to save that for our second conversation, which I truly hope we have at some point. Dr. Ramani, it's been such a joy speaking to you. It really has. This podcast is called Feel Better, Live More. When we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of our lives. For anyone who's listening or watching who feels a little bit lost in their life, a little bit stuck, maybe it's a relationship that they're struggling with, maybe they're procrastinating and they can't seem to make any changes. Have you got any final words of inspiration or wisdom for them?
I'd say this. I think because so many of us work on computers, not all of us, but many of us do. Lift your eyes. And that lift your eyes is a metaphor, not just even lifting your eyes off a computer, but lifting your eyes out of your life for a minute, right? Get a different view. Change things up, step outside. Even if it's wintertime, sometimes that whoosh of cold air can sort of change your perspective. The other thing I'm going to say is break things down, really break them down. Because I think the more you say, like, I am never going to get this house clean, I'll say, start with a drawer, just clean one drawer out. And if you want to keep going, keep going. But if not, you got one thing done. Whether you break things down by time, by task, I'll say to people, do the easiest thing first, because that builds efficacy. Like, oh, okay, look at that. I paid those 3 bills. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. Like, start with the easier thing, develop that sense of like, oh, I'm getting some things done, and go from there. Also, the other thing I'd suggest to people is, there was actually an interesting article in the New York Times about how messiness, like having a messy environment, is actually associated with mental health issues. And I think it's also associated with procrastination. Now, I understand some people say, well, actually clean to procrastinate. I do get that. And that's a subset of folks. But there's something about a messy space that can make it hard to get going. And cleaning something up is often a little bit easier than some of the other things we need to do. So maybe take that on. Say, okay, this is the area I'm going to work in. So let me make this tidy so I can work in this space. That could be another thing that you do. And then have some clear rewards. Say, if I work for 2 hours, 1 hour, 3 hours, whatever, 15 minutes, at the end of that, I'm going to allow myself to, whatever that 2 is. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to allow myself to play one game on my phone. I'm going to play with my dog. I'm going to call a friend. give yourself little meaningful rewards that actually feel good, so that, listen, again, like I said, we are existential rats in a maze. We always need some cheese to be hunting for. So figure out what your cheese is, give yourself those rewards, because I think that can also feel like, okay, I did this and now I'm doing this other thing and this is my reward. And so I'm going to keep going. You associate the task accomplishment or getting things done with a meaningful reward.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy this one, all about addiction, trauma, and why so many of us feel lost.
Addiction is the most human thing there is. All addictions, the attempts to gain pain relief, emotional pain relief, or something or another. Then this whole society is so expert at selling us stuff to fill those holes temporarily. This is the whole ethic of this culture.